When we moved to the small town of Pinefield, I had no idea how quickly our lives would change. My son Sam had always had a knack for making friends, even if they were unusual. He seemed to attract the oddball kids, the ones who didn't quite fit in. It never really bothered me. I thought it was part of growing up, but there's one incident that still haunts me to this day. Sam was in 3rd grade at the time. We had just moved because my husband got a job transfer, and Sam was starting at a new school. He was friendly and outgoing, so I didn't think twice about his ability to make new friends. We were adjusting well as a family, and things seemed to be going fine. I met some of the other parents, and they seemed like decent folks, so I didn't give it a second thought. A few months after we moved, I got a call from the school one afternoon. They asked me to come in to talk to the principal about an incident involving Sam and another student. I had no idea what was going on. Sam wasn't the type of kid to get into trouble. He was always so well behaved, and a fight was the last thing I'd expect from him. I remember picking him up from school that day, and he was quiet. Too quiet. That was odd in itself because Sam was usually full of stories, especially when something exciting or even slightly dramatic happened. When I asked him what had happened, he didn't answer. I tried again, but his silence made my stomach tighten with unease. At the principal's office, I left Sam in the waiting room and sat down across from Mr. Turner, the principal. He asked me a few generic questions about Sam's behavior at home, how he got along with other kids, whether he ever argued with us. I answered as honestly as I could. Sam was a sweet kid. I wasn't just saying that because I was his mum. I genuinely believed it. Mr. Turner then told me what had happened. Apparently Sam had gotten into a scuffle with a boy named Max after recess. I was floored. Max? Sam had always spoken about him with affection. They were supposed to be friends. How could this happen? According to the principal, Sam and Max had been the last ones outside that day, walking back to class when, without warning, Sam had pulled an eraser out of his pocket and hit Max over the head with it. Max had fallen to the ground crying out in pain. I couldn't make sense of it. That wasn't Sam. It was completely out of character. I pressed Mr. Turner for more details, but there wasn't much to go on. No one had witnessed it, but both boys confirmed the same version of events. The principal reassured me that Sam wasn't in trouble. He just wanted to inform me, and that was the end of it. Still, something didn't sit right with me. Sam remained eerily silent about the whole thing until that evening. As we drove home, he finally opened up. His voice was low, and he spoke slowly, as if still processing everything. "It wasn't really a fight, Mom," he said. "Max told me to do it." I frowned, not understanding. Sam went on to explain that they'd been playing a game of make-believe, some sort of superhero battle. Max had suggested that Sam use the eraser as a super weapon, and when he did, Max had collapsed, pretending to be hurt. Then, in a whisper, he'd threatened Sam, telling him that if he didn't act like he had seriously hurt him, he would make Sam pay for it later. I was beyond angry. My son had been manipulated, tricked into doing something he didn't understand. And Max? I didn't know what to think. Why would a kid do that to another one? I decided to handle it myself instead of going back to the school. That night, I went through the school's contact list and found Max's mother's number. Her name was Laura, and when I called, she was warm and friendly, almost too friendly. She said she'd heard about the incident and had already spoken to Max. She claimed he'd admitted the truth and that she had reprimanded him. I felt a strange knot in my stomach as she spoke, but I appreciated the fact that she was being upfront with me. But then she told me something that made me pause. She said Max had always had a tendency to act out of character, like he was sometimes someone else entirely. That struck me as strange. Laura said Max had seen several doctors over the years, and while they weren't sure what the issue was, they were optimistic he would grow out of it. She assured me that Sam would be safe, and that Max wasn't violent, just odd. I still felt uneasy. but I was willing to give it a chance. Laura invited Sam over for a sleepover to help smooth things over. At the time, I thought it was a good idea. Sam could help Max with his social skills, and hopefully they'd both move past whatever weirdness had happened. The night of the sleepover, I drove Sam to Laura's house. I met her at the door and we chatted for a while. She was nice enough and we enjoyed a glass of wine as we talked. Meanwhile, the boys were downstairs, and I could hear their laughter through the floorboards. It sounded like they were getting along, so I felt reassured. But there was something about Max's behavior that still nagged at me. I decided to ask Laura more about it. Her face shifted when I mentioned it. She lowered her voice and told me Max had trouble making friends because he sometimes acted like different people. He wasn't a bad kid, but there were times when he seemed disconnected from reality. She said he'd been to a few therapists, and one had even suggested he might have something called dissociative identity disorder. But she quickly assured me that he was getting better, and that the fact that he was playing with Sam was a good sign. I wasn't entirely convinced, but I appreciated her honesty. Laura promised me that Max wouldn't hurt Sam, and that it would be a good experience for both of them. The next morning, when I went to pick Sam up, I was greeted by a smiling boy holding his things in a bag. But as soon as we were in the car, he burst into tears. I was shocked. Sam never cried over something like this. He told me that everything had gone well until bedtime. The two boys had set up their sleeping bags in the basement, and everything seemed fine at first. But then, in the middle of the night, Sam woke up to hear a whispering sound. He looked around, confused, and saw the bathroom light flickering, but it wasn't a normal light. It looked like a candle. Sam heard Max talking in the bathroom, but he wasn't talking to anyone. He was talking to the mirror. And he wasn't calling himself Max. He was calling himself Mr. Jim. Sam was terrified. He said it felt like Max wasn't Max at all, as if he was someone else entirely. The whispers continued for what felt like an eternity. Sam was frozen with fear. He lay still, pretending to sleep, hoping it would stop. Finally, Max returned to the basement, acting as if nothing had happened. The next morning, Max was back to his usual self, but Sam was shaken. I could see the fear in his eyes. He told me he didn't want to go back there. I immediately called Laura to tell her what had happened. At first, she laughed it off, saying Max was just being creative. But the more I pressed her, the more her voice faltered. She finally admitted that Max's behavioral issues were more serious than she'd let on. She said he had been diagnosed with multiple personality disorder and that they had moved several times because of it. The last part was a whisper, as if it was a secret. She begged me not to tell the school. I didn't know what to think. Part of me wanted to respect her wishes, but another part of me felt like I couldn't let this slide. But before I could decide what to do, things escalated. The next week, Max attacked another student at recess. It was bad enough that the school had to send out a notice to all the parents. By the end of the day, Max was expelled. I tried calling Laura again, but her phone was disconnected. I drove to her house to talk to her, but when I arrived, the house was empty. No moving trucks, no signs of anyone leaving. They were just gone. I tried searching for them online, but there was nothing. No trace, no forwarding address. It was like they had never existed at all. That was years ago, and Sam is fine now. He's grown up and moved on, but I can't help but wonder about Max. I can't forget that night. What really happened in that basement? I grew up in a small town in the South, where everything felt simple and tight-knit, until you realized that the world around you wasn't as clear-cut as it seemed. My family wasn't ordinary, not in the way you'd expect, and especially not in the way they believed. We didn't talk much about ghosts, but demons? Now that was something we knew about. I never quite understood it, but my mom and dad were firm believers in the idea that any strange thing happening wasn't the work of lost souls. but something far darker, something from the depths of Scripture. I never really bought into it. There was something in me that couldn't fully accept this notion that every little oddity was a sign of something evil lurking in the shadows. But for them, rejecting the existence of demons was like rejecting the very foundation of their faith. My mom, though, she didn't seem to care much for the whole faith thing. She wasn't an atheist or anything, but she was indifferent. God and I have an understanding, she'd tell me with a shrug when I'd press her about church. For me, religion was a source of stability, something to hold on to when life felt messy. But with my mom, it was just a passing thought, a subject to avoid. She wasn't a bad person, but she had her struggles, ones that no one really seemed to notice at the time. Mental health issues, addiction. They weren't things people knew how to talk about back then, not in a way that could fix things. Some days, she was perfectly fine, functional even. Other days, she was a stranger, completely unpredictable. I didn't understand it back then, but looking back now, I think she might have had schizophrenia, or something close to it. It's strange to think about it now, but back then, no one had the tools to understand what was happening. People just whispered and looked the other way. One night I had a dream. It was vivid, so real that I still remember it clearly even now. In this dream I was lying in my bed trying to sleep when I heard the door slam open. It was my mom, her face twisted with anger, her eyes wide with fury. She grabbed me by the wrist, shaking me so violently that I couldn't breathe. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to calm myself. But then, something strange happened. The exact same thing happened again, only I wasn't asleep this time. My door burst open. There she was. Exactly like in my dream. Same angry look, same harsh grip on my wrist. She said the same words, and I froze. I barely managed to push her off, my voice barely a whisper as I begged her to stop. And then, just like that, she was gone. I ran to find her the next morning, asking her about it. She looked confused, almost hurt, like I was making it up. "What are you talking about?" she asked, but I could see that she didn't remember. I told myself it was just a weird coincidence, a nightmare that bled into reality somehow. But deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. A few weeks later, I heard her scream outside. It wasn't the kind of scream that would send chills down your spine out of fear. It was more excited. That's the best way I can describe it, though it still doesn't make sense to me. I rushed outside to find her standing in the yard, grinning like a maniac, holding a massive snake in her hands. Now here's the kicker. My mom had been terrified of snakes her whole life. Just seeing one on TV would send her into a panic. Yet there she was, holding this snake like it was a toy. She looked at me, grinning, and told me to come closer. I froze. "Mom, what the hell?" I asked, backing away slowly. But she just smiled wider, tilting her head like she was daring me to get closer. Her eyes were vacant, and I knew in that moment that she wasn't herself. I turned and ran back into the house, slamming the door behind me. My heart was hammering in my chest, and when I peered out the window, she was still standing there, the snake slithering on the ground at her feet like she was offering it to me. I didn't speak to her about it that day. When I asked her later, she just shrugged and acted like I was the crazy one, saying I must have dreamed it. But nothing could prepare me for what happened that winter. Our church was holding a lock-in, an overnight stay that was supposed to be fun, a chance for me to get away from home and be around people who didn't scare me. My mom dropped me off, sober and seemingly okay. But by 4 a.m., everything changed. We were just settling down for the night when a series of loud knocks echoed from the chapel door. At first we all froze, thinking it was someone outside, but the knocking didn't stop. It circled the entire building, moving in ways that made no sense. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, rhythmic, and as though something was trying to break in. I ran to wake the pastor who had the key, but by the time he came out, the knocking stopped abruptly. He opened the doors, and there she was, standing on the front steps, soaking wet and staring right at me. It was my mom. Her hair was dripping with sweat, her clothes all over the place like she'd been running through the night. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. And when she looked at me, I saw that same strange smile. It wasn't her. This wasn't the woman I knew. The pastor tried to stop me, but it was like something was pulling me to her. I had no choice but to go with her. The drive home was silent. No explanation, no words. Just the sound of the tires on the road and the oppressive silence between us. When we got home, she stopped in the doorway, watching me as I walked to my room. I closed the door, locked it, and lay awake for hours listening. The next morning, she was back to normal, like nothing had happened. She made breakfast and was cheerfully surprised when I came downstairs. When I asked her what had happened the night before, she simply shrugged. "I was just about to come pick you up from the church," she said, looking confused. I was stunned. She had no memory of knocking on the church doors, no recollection of coming to get me. The strangest part, no one at the church ever said a word about it. The pastor, the elders, no one. It was as if they didn't know what to make of it, or worse, maybe they didn't want to know. That was years ago, and my mom's long gone now. But that memory, it stays with me. I still don't know what to believe. Was she sick? Was it something worse? I try to convince myself that there's a logical explanation for it all, but deep down, I'm not so sure anymore. I remember when my eldest son Noah started sleepwalking. He was about 8, maybe 9 years old, and at first, it didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary. Kids go through phases, right? It's a thing. So when I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find him standing in the hallway, I didn't think too much of it. I figured it was just one of those things. He'd be standing there, his eyes wide open, but not really seeing anything. That part always freaked me out, though. Anyone who's ever lived with a sleepwalker knows what I'm talking about. Their eyes are open, but it's like they're looking through you, not at you. Empty, distant. It's like they're somewhere else entirely. I'm a light sleeper, so I could never miss a sound, even at night. No matter how quiet, nothing could slip by me. So when Noah started this sleepwalking, I was the one who noticed it. He'd be there in the hall, swaying slightly on his heels, his feet barely touching the floor, like he was walking but not really. His eyes would stay frozen in that blank stare, and sometimes he'd mumble something, but it was always too soft to make sense of. Other times he wouldn't make a sound at all, just standing there, breathing slow and steady. It was unnerving, to say the least. I'd gently call his name, whispering, trying not to wake my husband. I didn't want to startle him, or Noah for that matter. I'd guide him back to bed, telling him everything was okay, though he never remembered any of it in the morning. It was just part of the routine at that point. I never really thought much more about it until one night, months after I first realized Noah was a sleepwalker, something happened that made my blood run cold. It was late. I woke up to a soft, rhythmic tapping sound, like water droplets hitting glass, though I knew it wasn't raining. It wasn't the wind either. The sound was almost too precise. Tap, tap, tap. A steady rhythm. I couldn't ignore it, and it took me a few minutes to shake off the grogginess enough to figure out where it was coming from. It wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't the house settling. No, it was coming from the hallway. I got out of bed quietly, not wanting to disturb my husband. It wasn't fear I felt, not exactly. More like curiosity. I wasn't scared, just unsure of what I'd find. As I stepped into the hallway, I saw him, Noah, He was facing the wall, his forehead gently tapping against it, almost as if he was trying to push through. His fingertips followed the rhythm of his forehead, brushing the wall lightly, almost tenderly. I called his name, my voice barely a whisper. But he didn't react. He just kept tapping, his head knocking into the wall in a slow, deliberate rhythm, like he was trying to step into something that wasn't there. My heart raced as I took a step closer. I wanted to intervene, to shake him out of whatever trance he was in, but something stopped me. There was something about the way he moved that made me hesitate. Something wrong. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt a chill run down my spine. I reached out, placing my hand on his shoulder. He blinked, taking a small step back, and then, like nothing had happened, I led him back to his bed. He didn't remember a thing the next morning. That was the first time. After that, the sleepwalking continued but wasn't frequent. It was a strange, unsettling phase, but I figured he'd outgrow it. I convinced myself it was just one of those things, some odd behavior that came with being a kid. Eventually, Noah did outgrow it, and I forgot about it for the most part. But then, years later, when my younger son Eli started sleepwalking, the pattern returned. At first, I didn't think much of it. Kids are kids, and habits can repeat themselves, right? But as I watched him, I realized something wasn't quite right. He moved the same way Noah had, that same slow, eerie rhythm. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was reliving the past. And sure enough, one night I heard it again, the tapping, the same rhythmic knock. When I stepped into the hallway, there he was, Eli, pressing his forehead against the same spot on the wall, just like Noah had done all those years ago. I couldn't believe it. There was no way Eli could have known about Noah's sleepwalking. He was too young to remember it. Yet here he was, doing the exact same thing, same tapping, same unseeing stare. I called his name, but nothing. I touched his shoulder, but there was no reaction. It was like he was lost in some unreachable place, caught somewhere between sleep and wakefulness. It took a lot of effort to snap him out of it, but eventually, I did. I led him back to bed, tucking him in, and the next morning, just like his brother, he had no recollection of it. The sleepwalking stopped after that. Eli outgrew it too, and for years I didn't think about it. It wasn't until recently, after the kids had left for college, that the memories came flooding back. The house felt so quiet now. My husband and I had been talking about making some changes, so we decided to renovate. The place was old, and we thought it'd be nice to give it a fresh look. We started with the wallpaper. As we peeled back the old layers, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just an old stain or some kind of weird backing, but as we peeled more away, I froze. It was a mirror, an old antique one, covered by layers of wallpaper for reasons I couldn't understand. I felt this strange unease settle in my stomach. Why would anyone cover up a mirror instead of just removing it? I stood there staring at it, feeling almost ridiculous. But something inside me couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to find it. And that's when I saw it. The mirror was placed right where Noah and Eli had both been standing. The exact spot they had both tapped their foreheads against. The exact spot where they had been trying, unsuccessfully, to walk through something that wasn't there. I felt a cold wave of realization wash over me. How could they have known? How could they have both, at different times, been drawn to that exact spot on the wall? It made no sense. They hadn't seen it. How could they have? I didn't waste any time. I got rid of the mirror immediately, but I haven't been able to shake the feeling. Something about it doesn't sit right with me. I'm not sure what happened all those years ago, but now that the mirror's gone, I can't help but wonder, was it just a strange coincidence? Or was there something else going on? Something we weren't meant to see? I can't figure it out. I really can't.